Hi, I'm Dr. Rene Hackney. Welcome to Week 3, Part 2 of 8 Weeks to Positive Discipline. In this segment, I'm going to be talking about parenting styles and the impact of parenting styles on the discipline exchanges you have with your children. In the original research in the 1970s, the researchers put parents into 3 categories. They fell on a continuum from permissive parenting to authoritarian, with authoritative being in the middle. Permissive parenting was marked by parents who put relationships too far above rules. These were parents who were worried about being a friend and worried about being liked by their child. These were parents who maybe had warmth but low follow through, low expectation, low structure. Kids were allowed to bend rules. At the far other end, authoritarian parenting, this was more a military or reactive style, a domineering style in parenting. This were families where the rules were too far above relationships. This was the hard end of parenting with maybe too much structure and maybe too much follow through and heavy rules and heavy discipline. In the middle, where they hoped parents would find a healthy balance, was authoritative parenting. That was defined as parents who had a good balance between rules and relationships, who pulled the empathy and the positive intent from that more passive or permissive end, but who also pulled some structure and some expectation and follow through from the more authoritarian end. It's meant to be a place of good balance, and that's where positive discipline falls, is that good balance and the in-between in parenting, where both rules and relationships are important. Since the 70s, there have been countless psychologists and authors who have pulled together information on parenting styles and given lots of new labels, lots of new names to these categories, but really it's the same 3 categories. Originally permissive, authoritarian, and authoritative. I do particularly like Becky Bailey's breakdown in a book called Easy to Love, Difficult to Discipline. She talks about what parents in each of these categories sounds like in a discipline exchange, how they tend to use language with their children. And that's really what this series is all about, is how does your language work best in these moments of discipline. So as we go through and talk about what she sees as being important, or the important descriptors in each of these categories, I want you to think about yourself. How do you typically sound to your children as you move through a discipline exchange? So in the original research, that permissive parenting, Bailey calls that passive voice. This is a parent who maybe begs and bribes for behavior. Please be good in here just for 5 minutes. If you're good, I'll give you a lollipop. These are also parents who maybe ask vague questions. Are you doing what I asked? Are you where you're supposed to be? It doesn't give the child information for moving forward. This may be a parent who asks irrelevant questions. Why did you take your shoes off? It almost never matters why they took their shoes off. They need to keep their shoes on. This is also, and probably most importantly, a parent who repeats themselves a lot. Let's say you're asking your child to get their shoes on, but then you end up asking them to get their shoes on 5 or 6 times before they're ready to leave the house. When you're repeating yourself a lot, the unfortunate part is you're kind of teaching them to tune you out. So we're going to talk about how to not do that. Passive voice may also adjust their schedule often for their child. If you have a sick child or a new baby, of course you're going to adjust your schedule. But let's say without fail, it takes 45 minutes to get this 3-year-old dressed. That's a lot of effort, and there's probably too much negotiation happening in those moments. Passive voice may give the language of choice when there's not a choice available. So this would be a parent who said, "Hey, are you ready for dinner?" When you mean, dinner is on the table, come now, please. When you say, "Hey, are you ready for dinner?" there's fair game for them to say, "No." So it's only ask the question or put out the choices if choices are available. At the farther end, the authoritarian in the original research, Bailey calls this the aggressive voice. This is a parent who gives you messages often. You always interrupt. You never listen. This is a parent who maybe gives negative intent. I know you meant to hurt her, rather than positive intent. The aggressive voice may be threatening, maybe giving punitive threats. A parent who says, "Do you want a spanking?" Even if you've no intention of spanking this child, the idea is if you say those things a lot, it creates a climate of aggression. also giving overly severe consequences. The if you don't clean up these toys, I'm giving everything you own to Goodwill. Way bigger than the behavior, and you probably don't mean it. We're going to talk in week 4 about how to make consequences match. Also, physical response and discipline. Smacking fingers, grabbing arms, spanking, all falls under this aggressive voice. We're also going to talk about that in this series in week 7. Bailey does include an extra category. It's called the passive-aggressive flip. This is a parent who is trying to say it nicely, trying to get their child's attention. They've said it 6 times, and then they snap and yell at everybody. So it sounds like this. Come on, are you ready to go? Hey, it's time for your shoes. Could you turn off the TV, please, and get your shoes? I'm ready to go. Get your shoes. Okay, that's 1, 2. Do you hear me? I'm counting. Get your shoes. And nobody's moving, and the parent loses their cool and says, get your shoes. And then people snap into action because you raised your voice. This passive-aggressive flip. You're starting here, you're ending here. The idea if you're doing that is you're setting yourself up to have to do that more. They're learning. When you start talking, I gotta go 3 or 4 more minutes before you mean it. You're gonna say that 4 or 5 more times. And so they're learning to wait you out. They're learning to wait until you snap, until you yell at people. If you're doing that, it's likely going to get longer. It's likely going to get harder. And so the idea here is we want to use the assertive voice, that authoritative in the original studies, that someone with a good balance of rules and relationships, that yes, has empathy and positive intent, but also the structure and follow through of choices and consequence language. In Bailey's view, this assertive voice, this is a parent who offers clear, straightforward statements. It is time to go, put on your shoes. You can say please, but it shouldn't sound like you're asking them if they'd like to put on their shoes. So it shouldn't be a begging please in these moments where you're giving clear directions. It's time to go, put on your shoes, please. Also matching your verbal and your nonverbal. This is a parent who says, it's time to go as you pass them shoes or as you turn off TV. The idea there is you're moving along with them, better yet, in front of them, so you can help them if they need help with the listening. We're going to talk about not repeating yourself, which is the hardest part of this. But before we get there, warnings are good for most children. Most children benefit from having a warning somewhere in transition times. When my girls were little, my warning language, and I must have said these things 1,000 times. We're done in 5 minutes, finish up. 1 more minute, do your last thing. The we're done in 5 minutes, finish up gave them a 5-minute heads up, and then 1 more minute, do your last thing means move into action because we're about to go. That doesn't have to be the language you use, but something where you're saying it and you mean the same amount of time each time. You say it when you mean it. Even before my kids could tell time, when I say, we're done in 5 minutes, finish up, I really need to mean 5 minutes. If sometimes I mean 2 because I'm in a hurry and sometimes I mean 20 because I get distracted, I'm not helping anybody with my warning. You want them to get used to the consistency of it. And then 1 more minute, finish up, means 1 more minute, finish up, find your last thing. And so this idea of the language is to be consistent with your warnings, and most children do better if given warnings for transition. That said, once you get to the direction, it's time to go, put on your shoes, please. That's what you don't want to repeat. So that it's time to go, put on your shoes, please. Let's say you've been in the habit of repeating yourself a lot up until now. They're not going to magically start listening just because you decided to say things once. It's going to take some work on your part to undo that part of the habit. So let's say starting tomorrow, I say to my children, it is time to go, put on your shoes, please. They're not going to magically listen. They're waiting for me to say it 4 or 5 more times. So I want to move into action. Take the child to the shoes, take the shoes to the child, give them a choice about which step to sit on or which pair to wear, give them a challenge, how fast can they put them on, give them a job or a contribution, make them the shoe picker, make them the shoe carrier, giving them choices, challenges, contribution, moving into action to help them listen. You're creating a new habit. Your new habit is, I'm going to say things once, and I expect you to listen. Initially, it's I'm going to say things once and help you listen. When you get good at that part of the habit, at the not repeating yourself, is when you can start to expect them to listen the first time. But it can take a while. Now, if need be, not on the first day hopefully, but eventually, you might add consequence language. Let's say a couple weeks later, you say to your child, it's time to go, put your shoes on please. And they go, well, here's my foot. They're used to you following up, they're used to you moving into action. And that's where you could say, if you don't get your shoes on, your feet might be cold. And then their feet might be cold. We're going to get to that in week 4. So this idea of not repeating yourself is build a new habit, help them listen. Say it once, move into action, give them choices, challenges, contribution to get the behavior change going. This is one of the hardest habits to break. This is one of the hardest habits to shift. But the idea of it in the long run is you can have children listening the first time. You also want to only give choices when they really exist. The dinner's on the table and your child is buried in their Legos and you say, hey, are you ready for dinner? No's got to be an okay answer there. So don't ask that question. Don't put it out there as a choice or as a yes, no. Just say, dinner is on the table. Come now, please. You giving usable information means you're speaking in a complete way. The idea here is if you just say to a child who's playing at the sandbox and you want the toys to stay in, those go in, that's really vague. These are the sand toys. They stay down in the table. Sand toys stay in the table. That's much more specific and it's full information. iMessages from week 1. I'm angry. My lamp is broken. Good part of assertive voice. So the idea is to think about yourself. Do you tend to fall in that passive or permissive end of parenting, the authoritarian or the aggressive end of parenting, or in that middle? The authoritative, the assertive voice, the straightforward talk, the expecting and helping children to listen. This idea is you want to work yourself toward the middle. If you're at the permissive end, it's coming up with ways to follow through and being sure that your words mean something. If you're at the more aggressive or authoritarian end, working your way toward the middle is using empathy and positive intent. It's giving kids choices before consequence language. Out at that aggressive or authoritarian end, parents are often at consequences and it's heavy in the discipline. And so it's thinking about how do you move toward that middle.